Remake culture.
We are in the age of the remake.
Remakes everywhere. We are going to break down exactly how reboot culture became Hollywood's biggest addiction.
If it feels like everything is getting remade right now, that's because it is. Movies, TV shows, video games, if something was popular once, there's a really good chance it's coming back with a new coat of paint and a bigger price tag. Hollywood has been living off remakes and reboots for years now. Same stories, new actors, maybe a few tweaks, and suddenly it's for a new generation. Sometimes it works, a lot of times it doesn't, but either way, it's safe, it's familiar, and most importantly, it sells. Nostalgia has basically become the most reliable business strategy in entertainment in recent years. Gaming followed that same path, but for slightly different reasons. Old games don't just age visually, they get trapped on dead hardware with awkward control schemes and very outdated graphics. So remakes and remasters started as a way to preserve games, to make classics playable again without requiring a museum exhibit worth of old consoles, and at first that was great. Seeing an old favorite cleaned up, running better, and available on modern hardware actually seemed like a great thing. But somewhere along the way, that preservation angle started to blur into something else. Remakes became constant, remasters became expected, and ports started showing up at full price with barely anything changed. Which brings us to the question I want to ask, is remake culture actually a bad thing, or does it just get a bad rap? Now I could talk about this for all developers, but I want to specifically focus on Nintendo today, because Nintendo was a big part of normalizing this quote-unquote remake culture. Long before other companies figured out how valuable their back catalog could be, Nintendo was already repackaging old hits and selling them again to new generations. Sometimes they absolutely nailed it, other times it felt like the same game being sold again simply because they knew people would buy it. And the wild part is that both of those things can be true at the same time. Nintendo has made some of the best remakes in gaming history, and also some of the most confusingly overpriced ones. Before we start throwing specific games under the bus though, we need to clear something up, because a lot of the arguments about remake culture fall apart due to people using the same words to mean completely different things. When fans complain about remakes, they're usually talking about three separate categories without realizing it. A port is basically the same game moved to new hardware with minimal changes, maybe better resolution, but nothing fundamental at all. A remaster goes a step further, cleaning up visuals and performance while keeping the original game intact. And a remake is when a game is rebuilt to feel modern, often reworking mechanics, visuals, and basically like making a brand new game. The problem is that Nintendo doesn't always price or market these differently, which is where a lot of fans start to get frustrated. And that's why looking at Nintendo's remake culture matters more than just arguing about whether remakes are lazy or not. The real conversation is about effort, necessity, and overall value. When a remake actually improves a game, when it simply preserves it, and when it exists mostly because it's easier than making something new. So Nintendo remakes / remasters actually go as far back as the Super Nintendo with Super Mario All-Stars. At the time it wasn't framed as a huge nostalgic cash grab, it was actually very practical. So the NES was aging at this point, and the SNES was not compatible with it, so Nintendo brought the four 2D platformers on the NES to the SNES with improved 16-bit graphics. Basically just rebuilt it with those better visuals, had better sound, save feature, and bundled them together. People loved it because it felt generous. It didn't replace the originals, but it just gave an improved way to play them on the new system. That release quietly set a precedent. Nintendo learned two very important lessons at once. People wanted their old games back, and they were willing to pay for them again if the upgrade felt meaningful. At this point, there was really no remake culture, because the video game industry was still fairly new. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, Nintendo kept experimenting in small ways. Games like Link's Awakening DX and Super Mario Bros. Deluxe weren't full remakes, but weren't straight ports either. They added color, new features, quality of life improvements, just enough to justify existing again. These weren't controversial, no one was screaming about the pricing or if they were lazy. They were cheap, portable games aimed at players who either missed the originals or wanted them in a different format. Then the 2000s hit, and Nintendo realized they could do this a lot more often. The Game Boy Advance era is where things really ramped up. Suddenly Nintendo really leaned into bringing back their old games. NES games were getting straight up ports like Super Mario Bros. On the Game Boy Advance. SNES games were getting enhanced re-releases. Of course the Super Mario Bros. Advance series, which was kind of like a remaster remake of classic 2D Mario platformers. Zelda came back, there were Pokemon remakes, and for the most part it did work. The GBA made sense as a nostalgia machine. Playing old console games on a handheld was still novel at this time, and Nintendo wasn't pretending these were brand new experiences. They weren't overcharging, and remember, at this point, there were no digital console games, there was no way to play these games on the go as a Nintendo fan. This is also when some of Nintendo's earliest games really started to feel dated. There were plenty of games that just didn't age well. For example, Metroid Zero Mission. The original Metroid was historically important, but actually playing it in the 2000s was kind of miserable. Zero Mission wasn't just a port of it, it completely remade the game. It had new physics, better controls, new areas, new story content, and of course a map, which was one of the biggest things missing. This is an example of one of Nintendo's first remakes that really needed to happen. It took a game that wasn't bad, but just held back by its hardware, and remade it with far superior hardware. At the same time, Nintendo was also remaking games that didn't need a remake as much. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green came out barely 8 years after the originals, but they sold incredibly well. Now, these weren't unnecessary, but it also did feel a little bit like Nintendo was trying to capitalize on nostalgia. By the time the DS rolled around, Nintendo was getting more comfortable with remaking games, sometimes games they didn't need to. Super Mario 64 DS launched with the DS, and it was ambitious. It added characters, stars, new modes, a multiplayer mode, and it's not that this was lazy, but it really wasn't necessary considering the DS did not have 3D movement controls outside of the touchscreen. However, I do understand where Nintendo was coming from, and it's not like they overcharged this. Like, this was a normal price DS game, which was cheaper than a Nintendo 64 game. Nintendo would have more remakes and remasters as the DS and Wii era continued, but it didn't feel like a common occurrence. There were game collections like with the Kirby collection on Wii, with the Metroid Prime trilogy collection, and infamously the Super Mario Bros. All-Stars collection on the Wii, which was a straight-up port of the SNES version, but a lot of fans also looked past it as just being a collector edition for Mario's 25th anniversary. It feels like this was the last generation before Nintendo really ramped up production of old games coming back, because once the 3DS and Wii U came out, the shift became impossible to ignore. So the Wii U was Nintendo's first HD console, and surprisingly, they didn't remake too many games, probably because of the Wii U's poor sales, but most famously there was The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, which were remasters of the original GameCube games. They didn't change much, just an HD resolution, some quality of life features, better textures, and these games, depending on who you ask, could be seen as necessary. Wind Waker wasn't playable on Wii U, so it made sense to bring it back, especially considering it came out 2 generations ago. However, Twilight Princess had some more controversy. It was a full-price game, and you could play Twilight Princess on the Wii U through Wii backwards compatibility. On the handheld side with the 3DS, there were more remakes remasters. Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D were remasters of the N64 originals, and they had better visuals for the performance, better aiming, and of course portability. It brought 2 of the best games of all time to the 3DS, and while they were the same game, definitely looked a lot better. There were games like Star Fox 64 3D, Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, which may even be considered a demake with worse graphics than the original. Later on in the 3DS's life cycle, Metroid Samus Returns came out, which might be one of the most defensible remakes Nintendo's ever made. The original Metroid 2 is important historically, but actually playing it today like the original is extremely rough. Samus Returns rebuilt the game from the ground up and made it a lot more playable for a new generation. Up to this point, there still really wasn't a remake culture, because a lot of Nintendo's remakes made sense, and the ones that weren't completely necessary still did serve a purpose. The releases were spaced out and the improvements were obvious, and pricing didn't feel that unreasonable most of the time. When the Switch came out in 2017, this is where I would say remake culture really began for Nintendo. And just a quick note, when I say remake culture, I really just mean bringing back old games pretty constantly. As the Wii U sold pretty horribly, Nintendo pretty much ported every big game on the Wii U, and that made sense. However, these were full-price games. You paid $60 to get the Wii U version, you have to pay $60 to get the Switch version. This was already seen as controversial, as some of these games had been out for years at this point and had really nothing new outside maybe a new mode, but they did sell incredibly well. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the best-selling Switch game. Then there was Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, Pikmin 3, New Super Mario Bros. U, Super Mario 3D World, which actually did add a new game with it, and so many more that were ported. And before I get back to that, Nintendo also made really confusing remakes in 2019 on the Nintendo 3DS. By this point, the 3DS's life cycle was pretty much over. Everyone had moved on to the Switch, but Nintendo decided to make remakes of Luigi's Mansion and Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story on the 3DS. This is where people really started to begin questioning why this was happening. Bowser's Inside Story was already playable on the 3DS. Why did it need to come back? And why did it come out 2 years after the Nintendo Switch on the 3DS? Luigi's Mansion is another one. Why demake this game that could have just been made on the Switch if they really needed to remake it? I feel like this is where people really started to shift their opinions on remakes and remasters from Nintendo. Some of them just didn't make sense, and even the ones that did often had very controversial pricing. It wasn't always the case. Nintendo absolutely nailed some remasters, like Metroid Prime Remastered was completely necessary, being a remaster of a 20-plus-year-old game that was not playable on the Switch and only costing $40. But Nintendo has not been consistent with that. Super Mario 3D All-Stars was basically a port of Super Mario 64 Sunshine and Galaxy on the Switch for $60. Didn't do anything to improve these games, but it still sold anyway. From there, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It seemed like every year there were just multiple remakes coming out, and that's not to say all of these are bad, because there's been some truly great ones. Super Mario RPG in 2023 remade the SNES classic from the ground up with beautiful visuals, improved audio, and the quality of life features you'd expect. There was Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door in 2024, which brought one of the best RPGs ever back to the Switch and improved it. And while these were full $60 games, a lot of people people did see it as worth it. There's also been other ones like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Link's Awakening, Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, and you can make arguments if these were worth it, but most of these were full price games or $50, and it seemed like old games coming back were taking up more and more of Nintendo's release schedule. It seems like earlier last year is where fans really started to call Nintendo out for their habit of overcharging improved versions of older games. When Switch 2 was announced, suddenly games like Breath of the Wild, which came out in 2017 at $60, were being reintroduced with marginal performance boost and slightly sharper visuals. If you already owned it, you could pay a small upgrade fee, but if you didn't, you were now staring at $70 or even $80 for a 9-year-old game with almost no new content. Same world, same story, same controls, same everything pretty much, and that's where a lot of people finally snapped. Because at this point, it wasn't about game preservation, which is a big reason for remakes and remasters. It was Nintendo essentially saying that this game with marginal improvements is more expensive than what it was when it came out 9 years ago. Like, you're gonna tell me Super Mario Party Jamboree is worth $80 now just because you could do this? The frustration hit its peak with the Mario Galaxy situation. When Nintendo announced updated versions of Super Mario Galaxy and Galaxy 2, people were really excited because Galaxy 2 was left off of Super Mario 3D All-Stars 5 years earlier, and this time it wasn't just a straight-up port. It was a remaster with a higher resolution, smoother performance, better textures, and some other details. These are two of the best games Nintendo has ever made after all. But then we got the price. It was $70. Not for a full remake, not for new Galaxies, not for any major reworks, just 2 Wii games with light upgrades. Games Nintendo once sold for $20 each. One of these games had already been on Switch years earlier, and in that moment, a lot of the goodwill Nintendo had built over decades just evaporated for a lot of people. Because this wasn't about Nintendo pricing being a little high, this was about Nintendo pricing making no sense. When Nintendo announced Tears of the Kingdom being $70, they said that it wasn't going to be permanent and it was going to be a game-by-game basis. Tears of the Kingdom is a game you can sink hundreds of hours into, and it was a brand new expansive 3D Zelda game, so there wasn't too much pushback on this. And for the next couple years, there really wouldn't be $70 games by Nintendo. Now in 2025, that changed with more $70 and even $80 games, but that's not what we're talking about today. This year, games like Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Prime 4 Switch 2 Edition, Pokemon Legends ZA Switch 2 Edition cost $70, so Nintendo was saying Switch 2 games are worth $70. But then the Super Mario Galaxy Collection costs $70, and that's an original Switch game. So how exactly is that working? And it may seem like I'm going off topic, but this just feeds back into remake culture. People don't necessarily hate remakes. They don't even hate paying for old games again if it feels necessary. What they hate is when effort and value stop lining up. If you're charging modern AAA prices, the works need to feel modern too. That's why something like Metroid Prime Remastered stood out so much. Nintendo could have charged $60 for it, but they didn't, and people noticed. The praise wasn't just about how good it looked, but how fair it felt. You were paying $40 for an improved 20-year-old game. Compare that to something like Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, perfectly fine game that rubbed people the wrong way simply because the price didn't match the scope. And that's where Nintendo's remake culture finally becomes a real problem, not because they remake games too often, but because they've often blurred the line between preservation, modernization, and monetization so badly that players are left guessing what they're actually paying for. Nintendo knows their legacy is powerful, they know their games don't depreciate the way others do, and they know people will buy these releases anyway, sometimes happily, sometimes reluctantly, but almost always eventually. That confidence has let them push pricing further than most companies ever could, but now for the first time in a long while, it feels like fans are generally pushing back. Not because they hate Nintendo, well, not because all of them do, not because they hate old games, but because they want effort, but because they want remakes that actually mean something and want them to be priced fairly. So when people argue about Nintendo's remake culture, I think they're usually aiming at the wrong target. The problem was never that Nintendo makes too many remakes, because remember, Nintendo is aging now. The NES came out 41 years ago now. Some of these games deserve another chance for a new generation with updated visuals, and Nintendo's made well over 1,000 games. So it does make sense that they're going to want to bring back old games. As long as they're doing it in a way where they're really making it worth it and pricing them fairly, I don't see a problem. A remake that fixes fundamental problems, modernizes gameplay, and reintroduces a classic in a meaningful way should not feel equivalent to a barely touch-up port that exists mostly to fill a release gap. That's why the necessary versus unnecessary debate matters more than people realize. Because not all remakes are bad. A necessary remake usually solves something real. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, look at Silent Hill 2. The original game is very dated by today's standards, and the new one felt like a brand new game with a lot of love and effort put in. It feels like a brand new experience that took a classic and reimagined envisioned it with the hardware we have today. It's something that should feel justified the moment you pick up the controller. An unnecessary remake, on the other hand, isn't offensive because it exists. It's offensive because it asks for a full price without offering a real reason. Look at The Last of Us Part 1. The original came out on the PS3, the remaster came out on PS4, which made sense since the PS3 version could not be played on the PS4, but The Last of Us Part 1 just remakes this game that did not need it. It didn't change anything meaningful, just gave it slightly better graphics, and still charged full price. And that's where the pricing problem becomes impossible to separate from the conversation. Titles that were once budget re-releases or discounted classics, now positioned along brand new releases even when the scope doesn't match. A remake can seem necessary when it has an unreasonable price. It's going to get called out a lot more. To Nintendo's credit, this hasn't completely replaced innovation. They still make new games. Some of their best works of the past decade have been entirely original or at least creatively ambitious, but it's hard to ignore that remakes and remasters have increasingly become the glue holding release schedules together, and a lot of these don't really seem like they need to happen. I would love a lot of remakes and remasters of old Nintendo games, I just don't want to pay full price for them, and you probably don't either. Look at something like Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. It's a perfectly fine remaster, it's the Wii original, with a higher resolution, but this game was also remastered on 3DS, and cost $40. The original on the Wii cost $50. What makes it worth it $60 on the Switch? They announced a new Dixie Kong mode literally days ago, but was that necessary? I picked this up for $30, which seems like a much fairer price. So anyway, where does that leave Nintendo's remake culture? I don't think it's a disaster, and I don't think it's a scam factory. There are some games that genuinely do need remakes, or games that benefit from being remastered on Switch. Remakes and remasters aren't the enemy. Nostalgia isn't the enemy either. The problem starts when nostalgia is treated as a substitute for effort instead of a reason to apply it. If Nintendo wants players to keep accepting premium prices for old games, the value needs to be obvious for it. Something like Link's Awakening HD was clear about what it was, and made sense. Something like Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door on Switch made sense. But the Switch 2 editions, being priced more than their original counterparts, is just taking advantage, and seems to be an excuse for a lack of games coming out. So what do you think about remake culture in gaming for Nintendo? Do you think it's gotten out of control? Are you okay with certain remakes but want to see them priced differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe.